I didn't raise my voice. Not once. That's the part people always seem surprised by when I tell them what happened at my daughter's 40th birthday party. 200 guests, a rented ballroom, flowers my wife would have loved, and I stood there, perfectly still, while my son-in-law told me I was going to hand over everything I had built with my own hands. I didn't shout. I didn't curse. I just looked at him the way my father used to look at men who thought they were bigger than they actually were. And then I walked outside and made a phone call that he never saw coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand who I am and what he was trying to take before any of the rest of it makes sense. My name is Edward Calloway. I'm 64 years old. I have a daughter named Melissa, a granddaughter named June, and a restaurant on the corner of Birch and Clement Street in Henderson, Nevada, that I have been running for 31 years. It's called Calloway's. Nothing fancy about the name. My father always said that if you put your name on something, you'd better be willing to stand behind it every single day, because the day you start hiding behind a brand is the day you stop caring about what you're actually serving people. So, my name has been on that door since the day I signed the lease in 1994, and I have stood behind it every morning since. I built Calloway's from nothing. Not from a small amount of money. Not from a modest inheritance. From nothing. My wife, Patricia, and I had saved for 6 years before we could afford the lease on that space. She worked double shifts at the hospital. I drove a delivery truck during the day and cooked at a diner on weekends. We ate a lot of rice and beans in those years. We didn't complain about it. We had a plan, and when we finally opened the doors to Calloway's, we did it together. With a menu Patricia had helped me develop over 2 years of Sunday afternoon testing in our kitchen and a dining room we had painted ourselves over a long Labor Day weekend. Calloway's became something I never fully expected. Not a chain, not a franchise, just a real place where real people came because the food was honest and the service was warm, and you could count on the fact that what was on the menu today would still be on the menu next week. We built regulars who turned into family. We watched people bring first dates who became spouses who brought their kids. The restaurant became a kind of anchor in our community, and I felt the weight of that anchor the same way you feel the weight of something you're genuinely proud of, not as a burden, but as a reason to keep showing up. Patricia passed away 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught too late. She was 57. After she died, the restaurant became something different for me. It was no longer just a business. It was the place where I could still feel her. Her recipes were on the menu. Her handwriting was still on the laminated specials board behind the bar, because I couldn't bring myself to change it. Coming to work in the morning was the only way I knew how to keep moving forward, so I came every single morning, and I kept the doors open, and I kept her name alive in every dish we served. Melissa is our only child. She was 29 when Patricia died, and the grief hit her in ways that were hard to watch. She and her mother had been close in that particular way that mothers and daughters sometimes are finishing each other's sentences, calling each other twice a day, out nothing in particular. After the funeral, Melissa threw herself into work, into keeping busy, into forward motion, the same way I had. I worried about her. A father always worries, but she was strong in the ways Patricia had been strong, and I tried to trust that. She met Ryan about 2 years after her mother passed. She brought him to the restaurant on a Thursday evening in October, and I remember thinking he was pleasant enough, good-looking, well-dressed, confident in the way that men who work in sales are confident, like they've practiced the handshake and the eye contact until it's automatic. He sold commercial real estate, which meant he spent his days talking people into things. I've known enough salesmen in my life to understand that this is not a character flaw by itself. But I've also learned to watch the gap between who a person is when they're selling and who they are when they're not. Ryan was always selling. That was the thing I noticed first, and kept noticing. Every conversation was a transaction. Every story he told ended with him winning something. He was generous with compliments in a way that made the compliments feel like investments. He told me the restaurant was incredible, that the food was the best he'd had in Henderson, that I was obviously a man who understood quality. He said these things the way someone presses a button, and maybe I read too much into it, because Melissa was happy, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen since before her mother got sick, and that happiness mattered more to me than my discomfort with a man whose warmth always felt slightly manufactured. They got engaged 18 months later. Melissa called me from the parking lot of the restaurant where he'd proposed, crying happy tears, and I told her I was thrilled because the joy in her voice was real, and it reminded me so much of Patricia that for a moment I had to sit down. The first time I lent Ryan money, it seemed reasonable. He had a deal in the works, a commercial property on the east side of Henderson that was going to close in 6 weeks, and he had a temporary cash flow issue. He needed $12,000 to cover a bridge gap. He was apologetic about asking. He said he didn't want to start things off on the wrong foot with me, that he would pay it back with interest before the wedding. I gave him the $12,000. I didn't ask for a contract. He was going to marry my daughter. There are men who would have asked for paperwork, and I understand why, but I am not that man. Or at least, I wasn't then. The deal took longer than 6 weeks. 3 months in, he told me there had been a complication with the title. 4 months in, there was a zoning issue. At 5 months, the deal fell through entirely, and Ryan came to me looking genuinely devastated and explained that the $12,000 was gone, absorbed into fees, deposits, costs he couldn't recover. He offered to set up a payment plan. I told him not to worry about it. I told him it was a wedding gift, that these things happen in business, that I didn't want money to be a shadow over his marriage to my daughter. He seemed relieved. I noted that he did not seem particularly surprised. They married in June of that year. The wedding was beautiful, and I held it together until they played the song Patricia and I had danced to at our own wedding, and then I excused myself to the hallway for about 3 minutes and let myself feel the absence of her. Melissa found me there and hugged me without saying anything, which was exactly right. The second loan came 8 months after the wedding, $22,000 this time, for another deal that seemed solid, for reasons Ryan explained with the kind of confident specificity that makes things sound more legitimate than they are. I gave it to him. This time I felt a small tug of hesitation that I dismissed because I wanted to believe I was wrong about him. That deal also fell through. Different reasons, same outcome. By the time the third request came $35,000, which would have brought the total to $69,000. I said no. Not harshly, not with accusation. I simply said that I wasn't in a position to extend more credit at this time, that I hoped he understood, and that I believed in his ability to make his business work on its own merits. Ryan nodded and smiled and said, of course, completely understood, no problem at all. Something in his eyes did not match his smile. That was 7 months before Melissa's 40th birthday. I want to tell you about a man named Clifford Okafor, because you need to know about him before I get to the night of the party. Clifford has been my business partner and closest friend for 22 years. He came into my life when he applied to be my night manager at Calloway's and turned out to be the most naturally gifted person I've ever worked with in the restaurant business. He understood hospitality the way some people understand music intuitively, without having to think about it. Over the years, his role at Calloway's had grown. He now held a 30% ownership stake, which he had earned through years of building the business alongside me. He was also, and this matters, a former practicing attorney who had stepped away from law after 15 years to go into the restaurant industry because he said law had made him cynical and good food had restored his faith in people. Clifford knew everything about Calloway's, every lease, every contract, every asset. He also, because old habits die hard, knew every legal angle of every situation I had ever brought to him, including the $69,000 Ryan owed me, about which Clifford had opinions he expressed plainly, and which I had asked him, more than once, to keep between us. In the months before Melissa's birthday, I noticed Ryan becoming more present at the restaurant, stopping by for lunch, asking questions about the business under the guise of general interest, commenting on the dining room's square footage, asking once, with studied casualness, whether I had ever considered what the real estate itself was worth separate from the restaurant operation. I gave him vague answers and watched him more carefully. 2 weeks before the birthday party, I had a long conversation with Clifford. I told him what I was noticing. I told him about the questions Ryan had been asking. Clifford listened without interrupting, which is how you know he's taking something seriously. And then he said, "Edward, I think you need to be prepared. I asked him for what. He said, I think your son-in-law has been looking at Calloway's as a solution to a problem you don't fully know about yet. He told me to call a man named Gerald Watts, a commercial property attorney I'd worked with years ago. He told me there were some things I should have in writing before the birthday party. He was specific about what those things should say. I made the call to Gerald that same afternoon. Melissa's 40th birthday party was held at the Grandview Ballroom on a Saturday evening in early April. She had organized it herself, invited 200 people, family, friends, colleagues from the school, where she taught 3rd grade. She had been planning it for months, and she was radiant the night of the party, in a green dress she had bought in Reno on a trip she'd taken with her closest friends. She looked like her mother in the light of that ballroom, and it made my chest ache in the best possible way. I arrived early to help set up, and Ryan was already there, directing the catering staff with the authority of someone who has decided the event belongs to him. He greeted me warmly. He poured me a glass of wine. He put his hand on my shoulder and told me it was going to be a great night. I said I hoped so. The first 2 hours of the party were genuinely wonderful. People who hadn't seen me in years came and asked about the restaurant. Old friends of Melissa's told stories from their 20s that made her laugh the way Patricia used to laugh, head back, eyes closed. June, my granddaughter, who was 12 and had recently decided she was too old to hold her grandfather's hand in public, held my hand anyway for about 15 minutes while we watched her mother dance with friends, and I thought, this is enough. Whatever else happens in life, this is enough. Around 9 in the evening, I noticed Ryan making his way toward me across the room. His expression was different than it had been earlier. The warmth was gone. In its place was something more focused, more deliberate, the look of a man who has decided that the time for pretending is over. He asked me to step aside with him. I followed him to a quieter corner near the bar, close enough to the main room that a dozen people were within easy earshot. I don't think that was an accident. I think he had calculated that witnesses would pressure me. He started by telling me that he'd been looking into the financial structure of Calloway's. He said it with the tone of someone presenting findings rather than making conversation. He said he had spoken to a business consultant. He named the firm with the practiced confidence of someone who wants you to be impressed, and that they had assessed the restaurant's real estate value, the brand equity, the licensing, the whole picture. He said the assessment had come back at a number that he then told me. It was reasonably accurate. I said nothing. Then he said that given the current state of his business, and given the significant financial relationship that existed between us, he meant the loans. He thought it was time to formalize an arrangement that worked for everyone. He said he wanted me to transfer a controlling ownership interest in Calloway's to him. He used legal-sounding language, talked about a restructured partnership and asset consolidation. When I looked at him without responding, he simplified it. He said he wanted the restaurant. He wanted me to sign papers that his attorney had already drafted, transferring majority control. He said we could announce it tonight, that Melissa would be happy to see the family coming together around a shared business future. I looked at him for a long moment. I said no. The word came out quietly, cleanly, the way my father used to say things when he was absolutely certain. One syllable. Final. Something shifted in Ryan's face. The professional composure cracked at the edges. He moved slightly closer and lowered his voice in a way that was meant to be intimidating. He said that I didn't understand the situation fully. He said that the loans constituted a business arrangement that gave him certain legal claims. He said, and I remember this precisely because it was the moment I understood exactly what kind of man I was dealing with, that he had documentation suggesting the loans had been given as investment capital rather than personal. Loans, which meant he had a stake in Calloway's already, whether I acknowledged it or not. It was a lie. A specific, deliberate, legally constructed lie that he had prepared with time and assistance. I looked at him again. The ballroom was warm and full of music and people who loved my daughter. I could see Melissa across the room, laughing with her friends, her green dress bright against the white tablecloths. I said, I need to step outside for a moment. Ryan said, Edward, we're not done. I said, yes, we are, and I walked toward the exit. He followed me. He stepped in front of me before I reached the door, right there in the middle of the party, where people could see. His voice was no longer low. He said that I was making a mistake, that I needed to think about what I was doing, that he had invested years in this family, and he deserved something for that. He said, and now people were beginning to notice that I was going to give him what he was asking for, or he would make sure the next few years of my life were very difficult. My daughter's voice came from somewhere behind him. Ryan? Uncertain? Worried? He turned halfway toward her and then back to me, and in that moment he grabbed my arm. Not a push, not a shove, he grabbed my arm above the elbow and squeezed and said my name like a command. I looked down at his hand on my arm. I looked back up at his face. I said very quietly, "Let go of my arm." He didn't let go immediately. There was a second, maybe two, where he held on, and in that second I watched something move behind his eyes, some calculation about how far he was willing to take this in public. Then he released my arm and stepped back. I walked outside. The April air in Henderson at night is cool and dry, and smells of the desert if you get away from the parking lots. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the Grandview Ballroom, and I took 2 slow breaths. Then I took my phone out of my jacket pocket, and I called Clifford. He picked up on the second ring. I said, "It's tonight." He said, "Are you all right?" I said I was. He said, "Gerald is standing by. Do you want me to come?" I said yes. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. I went back inside. Ryan was standing near the bar with a drink in his hand, talking to a man I didn't recognize, performing normalcy. Melissa was by the dessert table, and she looked at me when I came in with an expression that told me she had seen more than I realized. She started toward me, and I shook my head slightly and smiled. The way you smile at your daughter when you want her to know that everything is being handled and that tonight is still her birthday and that you love her. She stopped. She watched me. She didn't go back to Ryan. 40 minutes later, Clifford walked into the ballroom with Gerald Watts and a woman I recognized as a notary they had apparently arranged on very short notice. Ryan saw them come in. I watched his face from across the room. I watched him recognize Clifford, whom he had met at the restaurant several times. I watched him try to identify the other 2 people. I watched the drink in his hand go very still. Clifford walked to me first. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "You doing okay?" I told him I was better now. Gerald greeted me and opened his briefcase and laid several documents on an empty table near the wall. He spoke to me briefly in a low voice, confirming that everything was in order, that the papers Ryan's attorney had apparently drafted were legally meaningless, given the actual documentation around the loans and the restaurant's ownership structure, and that if Ryan wished to pursue any claim, he was welcome to try. Ryan came across the room. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the tension under it. He asked who these people were. I introduced them. I introduced Gerald as my attorney. I introduced the notary. I introduced Clifford and mentioned, for the first time in Ryan's presence, that Clifford was a 30% owner of Calloway's and a former practicing attorney with 22 years of experience in business law. Ryan said, "What is this?" Gerald handed him a single document. He explained that it was a formal demand for repayment of $69,000 in personal loans, with interest accrued at the legal rate from the date of each loan, and that should Ryan prefer to dispute the personal nature of the loans and insist on the investment capital characterization he had apparently been developing, Gerald was prepared to treat the full amount as a business investment, at which point Ryan's equity stake in Calloway's would be calculated based on the restaurant's actual valuation, which was considerably lower than what Ryan's consultant had apparently told him, owing to the outstanding debt obligations and the cost of the right of first refusal clause in the partnership agreement with Clifford, a clause which gave Clifford the ability to match any outside purchase offer at par value. Ryan stared at the document. He looked up at me. I said very quietly, "You owe me $69,000, Ryan. That's all this is." He said I was doing this to humiliate him. He said it in a voice that had started to lose its composure. And because the ballroom had quieted around us, people had noticed. The way people at parties always notice when something is wrong, the words carried farther than he intended. I said, "I'm not doing anything to you. You came to a birthday party with papers drawn up by an attorney to take my restaurant. I'm simply responding. Someone in the room said something I couldn't make out. Ryan's jaw tightened. Melissa appeared at my side. She had come across the room without me seeing her move, and she was standing close to me, her arm touching mine, looking at her husband with an expression I cannot fully describe. It was not hatred. It was worse than hatred. It was the expression of someone watching a person reveal themselves to be someone they had never actually been. She said, "Ryan, is this true? Did you come here tonight to do this to my father?" He turned to her. He began to explain. He had prepared for this explanation. I could tell he had the points organized, the tone calibrated, the reasons lined up. He talked about their financial situation, about pressure he'd been under, about opportunities that he'd been trying to build for their family. He said that the restaurant was sitting there as an underused asset and that he'd only been trying to build something for them, for all of them. Melissa let him finish. She gave him the respect of actually listening to the whole thing. And then she said, "You borrowed money from my father 3 times and didn't pay it back. And then you showed up at my birthday party to try to take his restaurant." She paused. "And you never told me any of this." He said her name. He said it the way people say a name when they're reaching for something that used to work and can feel it not working anymore. She stepped closer to me, and without turning to look at me, she reached down and took my hand, the way she had done when she was a little girl, the way June had done earlier that evening. I held her hand, and I did not say anything at all, because there are moments that do not require words, and this was one of them. Ryan stood there for a long moment. The ballroom was very quiet. 200 people who had come to celebrate my daughter's birthday were watching a man understand that the strategy he had been building for months had collapsed completely, publicly, and irreversibly. He set down his drink. He straightened his jacket. He walked to the exit with whatever dignity he had left, which was not much. No one said anything until the door closed behind him. And then, because Melissa is the strongest person I know, she turned to her guests and said, "I believe the cake is still intact. Somebody please put the music back on." And people laughed, the slightly nervous laugh of witnesses who are grateful to be given permission to move forward. And someone started the music again, and my granddaughter, June, appeared from somewhere and wrapped her arms around both of us at once. I didn't cry until much later, alone in my car in the parking lot after the party ended. Not from sadness, exactly. From something more complicated, the relief of things being over, the weight of having been right about him, the grief of knowing that being right was going to cost my daughter something real. I sat there for a while and thought about Patricia, the way I always do when things get hard. I thought about what she would have said. I think she would have said exactly what she always said when something unfair happened. Well, now we know. And then she would have gotten up and made coffee and started working on the next thing. So that's what I did. In the weeks that followed, Melissa filed for an annulment. Her attorney, she found her own, a woman she trusted. Not anyone connected to. Ryan argued that the marriage had been entered under false pretenses, given the financial manipulation and the concealed debt that had been accumulating since before the wedding. Ryan, faced with Gerald's documentation and Clifford's institutional knowledge of every dollar that had moved between our families, chose not to contest it. He also, under separate legal pressure, entered into a repayment agreement for the $69,000. He sold his car. He moved out of the house he and Melissa had been renting and moved into an apartment. I was told this by Melissa, who told me with no particular satisfaction in her voice. She was not happy about any of it. She had loved him, or she had loved who she believed he was. And the distinction wasn't really a comfort. I want to be honest with you about something. The months after the party were not triumphant. Winning, if you can call it that, did not feel the way I thought it would. Melissa was grieving genuinely, quietly grieving the marriage and the future she had imagined, and I was watching my daughter grieve, and there was nothing I could do about it except show up. I had her and June over for Sunday dinner every week. I cooked the things Patricia used to make, the dishes that meant home, and I let Melissa talk when she wanted to talk and be quiet when she needed to be quiet. June, who understood more than a 12-year-old should have to understand, asked me once, while we were doing the dishes together after one of those dinners, whether I was angry at her dad. I thought about it before I answered. I said that I wasn't angry anymore. I said that I had been and that the anger was understandable, but that carrying it around was like carrying around someone else's luggage, and that at my age, I had enough luggage of my own. She thought about this for a second and then said, "That's actually a pretty good way to put it." I told her her grandmother used to say something similar. She said, "I know. Mom told me." We finished the dishes and went back to the table where Melissa was looking at old photographs, the ones I keep in the binder, on the kitchen shelf, photos of Calloway's in its first year, photos of Patricia in the kitchen, photos of Melissa as a child sitting on the counter while her mother rolled out dough. I sat down next to Melissa and looked at the photographs with her, and we didn't talk about Ryan, and we didn't talk about the party, and we didn't talk about anything in particular. We just sat there, the three of us, in the kitchen of the house where Melissa had grown up, surrounded by the evidence of everything that had endured. Calloway's is still open. Every morning I arrive at 6:15 and I start the prep that can't be done the night before. And I think about what my father told me about putting your name on something. I think about the fact that my wife's handwriting is still on the board behind the bar, and that people who have been coming for 20 years still stop to look at it sometimes. The way you look at something that is both ordinary and irreplaceable. Clifford is still my partner. He still handles the legal side of things with a thoroughness that I find both reassuring and slightly exhausting. He was right about Ryan, as he was right about most things. I have never told him so directly because he would be insufferable about it, but I told him once, obliquely, that I was glad to have him in my corner, and he said, "Always, Edward. That's not a loan. That's a permanent arrangement." I think about what Ryan wanted. I think about the calculation behind it. The loans he probably never intended to repay, the consultant he hired, the attorney he found, the papers he had drawn up, all of it aimed at a corner of Birch and Clement Street, where an old man went every morning because it was the place he built with the woman he loved. I try to understand it, not to excuse it, but to see it clearly, because clear sight is the only thing that protects you from being surprised again. And I think about the moment Melissa took my hand in that ballroom. That moment will stay with me for the rest of my life. Not the look on Ryan's face when Gerald handed him the document, not the sound of the door closing behind him. Those things are satisfying in a way that fades. What stays is my daughter's hand in mine, the same hand I held when she was small and frightened, and the world was bigger than she knew how to manage. She reached for me. After everything, the grief of losing her mother, the years of trying to build a life, the slow, terrible realization of who her husband actually was, she reached for me. That is the only thing I built that matters more to me than the restaurant. I didn't raise my voice, not once. Some people, when I tell this story, say they would have done it differently. They say they would have confronted him sooner, or louder, or harder. And maybe they're right for themselves. I can only tell you what I know. The quietest thing I have ever done was the most powerful. I walked out of that ballroom and made a phone call, and I let the truth be the loudest thing in the room. My father used to say that a man who has built something real has nothing to fear from a man who only wants to take it. I think he was right. I think about that most mornings at 6:15, when I unlock the door and turn on the lights, and the smell of the kitchen comes back to me. Butter and coffee, and the particular warmth of a room that has been fed by the same fire for 31 years. And I think, this is still mine. This is still ours. And I put on my apron and I start the day.